Oh, you almost had it. You gotta be quicker than that.
So the Puma hat is on, and if you're a fan of this channel, you probably know what that means. The 2019 61st running of the Daytona 500 has just concluded about an hour ago at the time that I am recording this. And right off the bat, I have to say that this race was objectively better than last year's race. And it exceeded by a long ways my expectations for the competition level in this particular race. This Speedweeks was one that will probably go down in infamy for several different reasons. And not the least of which was the fact that Speedweeks kind of became exposed, particularly on the Cup side, but the Xfinity and truck races also didn't leave a whole lot for race fans to get too jazzed up about. The main problem in the Cup Series was cars running up at the top of the track without being able to make too many passing moves or form up in the gigantic packs that NASCAR fans have come to expect from the restrictor plate racing of Daytona and Talladega. That changed in today's race, and we had a much more traditional Daytona 500. Unfortunately, having a traditional Daytona 500 also meant that only three, finished the race without being involved in an accident. That is 3 out of 40. So I'd be remiss and I'd be hypocritical if I judged this race based on what happened solely in the last 10 laps. And even that said, the winner ultimately deserved the win this year versus last year. I don't believe that was the case. And I think, judging by the previous winner's performance in this particular race, I think you might tend to agree with me on that one. So I'll talk some real quick positives. I'm going to go down some positives, some negatives real quick, and then I'll go into more detail in terms of exactly what I think of this race and kind of my analysis of the Speedweeks as a whole. So positives, and there are a lot of positives. Like I said, you have a legitimate winner. Denny Hamlin absolutely earned it. He's won it in the past. He won it in what I consider to be one of the better modern Daytona 500s in 2016. Certainly the best finish in very many years. He got a true blue win. He kept the car clean. He got up front when he needed to and made all the right moves, including a political one towards the end of the race to get himself in victory lane. Another positive. Joe Gibbs Racing going to victory lane. Certainly, that was a great story, considering that the 11 car was kind of J.D. Gibbs's car. It carried his name on it. Joe Gibbs obviously losing his son to brain disease earlier this winter. Good story. Heartwarming. A lot more heartwarming, by the way, than the 20 years later thing with the 3 car last year. This was genuinely heartwarming. There's a genuine connection there. So, thumbs up. We saw the race dominated by a driver that many of us, I think, wrote off and didn't think would be able to compete and race for a win. Matt DiBenedetto. I think a lot of people forgot, and I think I even pointed out on Twitter one time, I had to keep reminding myself that he wasn't racing for Furniture Row Racing. But then somebody pointed out in the comments, well, yeah, he kind of is. That is the car that was at Furniture Row Racing last year. At least that's the technical alliance that was at Furniture Row Racing last year, which is to say Matt DiBenedetto was essentially a Joe Gibbs racing car. And boy, did he prove that he belonged. Now, of course, again, plate track, you get kind of different drivers up there who maybe aren't NASCAR's elite level racing drivers. I get that. David Reagan was running 5th for most of the race. I get it. But we have seen Matt DiBenedetto put on some absolutely stunning performances in equipment that has not been certainly front-running equipment. You look at that Bristol race where I think he got 5th or 6th place. I mean, that was a fantastic result. So are we looking with Levine Family Racing at another emergence of a Furniture Row Racing style organization with a driver kind of like Martin Truex Jr. in a lot of ways that hasn't quite got the opportunities that a lot of other drivers have. Now, certainly Truex got a lot more opportunities than DiBenedetto ever got, but DiBenedetto shone in the absolute right moment. The biggest stage with the best opportunity he's got, and he's up there leading the race, dominated it. I believe he led the most laps of the race. So, yeah, that was fantastic. That was really exciting. And in fact, DiBenedetto really kind of led the most compelling portion of the race for me, which was the second stage, where you had DiBenedetto leading a line of 6 or 7 cars, and they were actually going so fast around the track that they were able to catch the back of the pack. I mean, these were competitive cars too. These were Kyle Larson and Chase Elliott and Martin Truex Jr. They caught them and were able to start lapping them. I mean, it felt like, that was a moment that felt like it was right out of 1997. And in fact, I would say after the unfortunate caution where the face car blew up, but Corey LaJoie, from that point until about, I would say, probably the start of the third stage, maybe a little bit past the start of the third stage. I mean, that felt like an old school Daytona 500 to me anyway, someone who grew up with that style of race. I mean, that felt old school. Was the passing as easy as it would have been in 1997? No, and we'll talk about that a little bit later in terms of the package itself, which I think is inherently flawed. But on a whole, the race was compelling. It was very interesting. The strategy itself lent itself to creating a race where you kind of had questions. You didn't really know what was going to happen. If a yellow comes out here, X, Y, and Z drivers are going to get caught a lap down, and what's going to happen here, and who's up front, and when are they pitting? That was quite good. By the way, I should mention as well, I think I mentioned Martin Truex Jr. was one of the drivers getting lapped. Yeah, Daniel Suarez, looking like a guy who's maybe a little more talented than people were giving him credit for. Certainly, he had a pretty decent race. I know he got wrecked, but he had a pretty decent Speedweeks. He looked pretty strong now and then, and certainly the 19 car with Martin Truex Jr. and Cole Pearn and a lot of that Furniture Row racing team that was so successful over the last 2 years, it was nowhere to be found. So then we kind of move in to the negative aspects of, well, I guess one more positive. We did get the bottom lane to come in. That was a key moment in the race because we only saw the outside lane train once, and it was very lucky because it was coming down to the final 20 laps of the race where you'd expect drivers would want to protect their position to try to, position themselves best for that final 5-lap shootout. Kyle Larson lost a tire. I speculated on Twitter that Jim France was up on the scoring tower with a sniper rifle and was firing warning shots at the drivers to tell them not to do that. Because believe it or not, Jim France, and he's been getting a lot of positive press throughout Speedweeks for his contributions to NASCAR in such a short time. Jim France in the drivers' meeting came out and said to the drivers, I want you to be like Denny Hamlin or be like Chase Elliott. I want to see you guys actually try the bottom, put on a good show for the fans. That's very Bill France-like, I have to say. So even though, as a racing purist, I understand that it's not the driver's job to go out there and entertain the TV audience. It's up to NASCAR to produce the package that will produce the most entertaining racing. That's on them. But it's a very Bill France style of thing to take charge and really smack the drivers around a little bit to say, look, you got to do it this way, or at least you got to put on a show because, look, we're in the showbiz business, as NASCAR has said many times throughout the Speedweeks, especially this Speedweeks. It seems like the debate about the show has almost kind of gone well past what the race is all about. And so that leads us into kind of where we get into the negative aspects. And I think first we need to talk about that finish. And at the end of the day, there were 3 cars, those being the 2 drivers that finished first and second. You've got Kyle Busch and the eventual winner, Denny Hamlin, as well as Ross Chastain. I would say, could somebody give him a good ride? He got a good ride, but as Mike Joy said, the sponsor got in trouble with the government. And by the way, holy smoke, was Fox on the NASCAR payroll or what during this race? I mean, they were bad last year. They were even worse this year. I know Mike Joy reads Twitter. He's read my Twitter. He probably looks at my Twitter. He found Daytona Day at one point. He was trying to dunk on all of us who were saying the race was going to be single file the entire time. And then, you got DW and Jeff Gordon talking about, oh, wow, look, there's 100,000 people here. Of course, nobody's talking about how there was 150,000 people that used to show up at Texas. Where have all those people gone? And just, it was constant brown nosing from Fox. And it really, and I'm someone who studied broadcasting and studied journalism, and the lack of objectivity is so frustrating from Fox. I mean, they make no bones about it. They're playing on the NASCAR team. They're not journalists covering an event. They're almost carnival barkers in a lot of ways, trying to get their point across. Uh-oh, they're coming for me. I've said too many truths. But then you get on to the package, and this is something that I'm going to definitely expand upon. There's a major debate between yours truly and Mr. Eric Estepa when we were discussing exactly what was to blame for such a lackluster Speedweeks. And I'm still going to, now certainly and I think the drivers did prove today that there was definitely a little bit of something that they could do to race a little bit harder. They certainly raced a lot harder in this Daytona 500 than they did in the duels or the Clash. And that's something we're going to talk about a little bit later, because the duels and the Clash may be outdated at this point because they're so unnecessary. But I think you still got a package problem. These cars are so aerodynamically sensitive, it almost turns it into an open wheel race. And I'm sure many of my haters will say I'm fairly well qualified to talk about what makes a good and a bad open wheel race. And unfortunately, what happens when you have very aerosensitive cars, very aerodynamic cars where downforce is the main driving aspect of what, makes the car make lap time, the more downforce you rely on, the more you rely on perfect atmospheric conditions to produce the kind of racing that you want. So that's why we saw and we heard from guys who I assume, but not necessarily believe because they were coming from Fox, saying that guys like Darrell Waltrip and Jeff Gordon were saying, look, when it gets warm, Larry McReynolds was another one, when it gets warm, the racing will get better. As it turns out, it was a warm day, the racing was better. But we did see, as the race began, or as the track began to cool off, as the sun began to set, you noticed that suddenly runs became harder to get. Drivers weren't moving around a lot, as much, I should say. You saw what was kind of a somewhat strung out field where cars were able to make moves in between other cars. You suddenly started to see the cars start to do the 200-mile-an-hour pace lap that we kind of refer to. And there wasn't a whole lot of room to maneuver, and that comes down to the aerodynamics of the cars. Unfortunately, we've gotten to the point, and this was especially true in the Xfinity race, where we have the fallacy of close racing. We always talk about, or you always hear people pining for close racing. We need close racing. It needs to be closer competition. Well, you had about as close a racing as you could possibly have, both in the Xfinity race and the third stage of this race, but you really didn't see a whole lot of competition. You didn't see drivers who were clearly very fast. Once they got in the back, they weren't able to move forward. Kind of the exception was Joey Logano, but a lot of the moves he made were on the restarts. Once guys like William Byron got back there, and even at one point Matt DiBenedetto got stuck back there, they weren't moving to the front very quickly. And that was just because they simply had nowhere to go. So, and here's the unfortunate thing, because of the amount of accidents that we saw towards the end of the race, and boy, was that embarrassing. I mean, it's straight up embarrassing. Let's not make any bones about it. And it's the second year in a row it's happened. It's not even like it's an outlier. You can say, oh my God, that was the biggest, pile of, that was the Daytona 500 where 6 cars finished and only 3 of them weren't involved in a wreck. But you can't even say that because last year was the exact same situation. The only thing that really made this better this year in terms of the wreck fest was that the leader didn't get wrecked 1 mile from the checkered flag. You have a race that you claim is a major race. Everybody gets excited about it. They tune in, and it turns out to be a demolition derby at the end of the race. And by the way, another thing that NASCAR really needs to work on, and I think the time has come, if you don't eliminate the green-white checker entirely, you should limit it to one at this point. We saw in the ARCA race that it seemed to work. When we had last year, there was a massive amount of carnage and 2-hour delays to get a winner to run one lap. If you'd run one green-white checker or one attempt to get to 500 miles, you would not have had as much carnage, and you wouldn't have had 2 red flags that would have that extended the amount of time that people are expected to sit there and wait for you to declare Denny Hamlin the winner. I think he was leading for most of the last portion of that last 10 laps. It's not compelling TV to watch that red flag take place, and quite frankly, it doesn't make drivers that you continue to claim are the best drivers in the world. To a casual audience, you can't claim that they're the best drivers in the world when they're wrecking, one lap from the finish. And that was another interesting segment that Fox Sports did, where a couple of drivers straight up admitted that they would wreck their grandma to win the race, and then other drivers like William Byron were like, I would do everything but wreck them. Interesting character study there. So I guess we'll talk. Well, this is something that I wanted to bring up. There was a bit of a controversy in the middle of the race where we had a pit lane incident which took out Jimmy Johnson. Well, didn't take out Jimmy Johnson, he ended up finishing 10th, but involved Jimmy Johnson and a bunch of other lead lap cars, where the Rick Ware racing cars got into each other and spun down the pit lane and cleaned out a bunch of cars in the process. And boy, a lot of people were complaining about Rick Ware Racing and how slow they are. And wouldn't it be nice if there was a system in place that, I don't know, let's say if there was a way you could define some qualifications for someone to make the Daytona 500, determine who really are the fastest 40 cars. If you could do something like that, and certainly you wouldn't want to have some system in place where a slow team could just buy their way into every race. Wouldn't that be nice? Wouldn't it be nice if cars that were actually competitive were able to make the show, and the cars that clearly are not and clearly just there to collect a last place paycheck would be bumped out of the field? Wouldn't that be nice? Oh yeah, the charter system exists and completely has ruined Daytona 500 Speedweeks. I can't speak for the Clash so much, and that's the one that really confuses me as to why that race was so painfully awful. But you get to the 125 or the 150s or whatever they call them now, the duels. You get to the duels, and the duels were just as abhorrent races as the Clash was. And ultimately, it comes down to the fact that what on earth, when you've got a race where qualifying position doesn't even really matter all that much, considering you've got 2 mandatory cautions and you've got the pack racing where you are only going to be 1.5 seconds at most behind the field if you're in the draft, is there a lot of incentive to fight very hard for a qualifying position in the Daytona 500? And considering the fact that there were only 4 drivers, I think it was only 4 drivers that were actually competing in each dual race, and really it was only 2 drivers in each dual race that were racing against each other. Now, I know the conventional wisdom, and believe me, I was an American Le Mans Series fan in 2011. I understand that all you need for a good race is 2 cars, but that doesn't lend itself very well at a plate track where you've got the 2 wrecked buckets of F in the back that are trying to race each other, where you've got a package that causes throttle response to be absolutely nothing, and the 2 cars lose the draft and they run side by side for 5 laps because neither car is able to get any kind of advantage. And here's the thing that's kind of upsetting to me looking towards the future, is that Darrell Waltrip was bringing up in the booth. We're going to talk a little bit more about Fox because God almighty, it was terrible. And somebody said that it was Chris Meyer's last Daytona 500. Thank God. He made a baseball comparison and then said it wasn't your daddy's NASCAR. And it's like, oh my God. Oh, all right. Anyway. So DW made the comparison, or at least tried to sell the next race at Atlanta as saying, it's going to be just like this. Cars are going to be packed together. It's going to be pack racing. Boy, owners, get your checkbooks ready, because you're going to have a guy like Matt DiBenedetto up there, and Paul Menard's going to shove him, and they're going to wreck, and there's going to be 20 cars torn up every time they go to a 1.5 miler. Imagine having to have 2 or 3 red flags at the end of every race. Now, I know that's doomsday scenario, and I had a doomsday scenario for this race, that it would be a train race at the top. That did not happen, and thank God, NASCAR, it didn't happen, because it may stop a bit of the bleeding from the TV ratings that almost certainly are expected to drop. It's not a total certainty, but it's more or less a certainty that they're probably going to drop for this year, as they've been in a free fall since about 2013. So, getting kind of to the end of this, I also want to give a shout out to Eric Jones. Guy has proved he's for real, at least on the plate tracks. He ran third in a car that dropped fuel pressure at one point during the race and was also wrecked. That is a pretty spectacular performance. Then you go to Ryan Preece, a fantastic debut from him. It did seem a little bit like Bubba Wallace's last year, so it could be a bit of a fluke. We'll have to wait and see again. Well, I guess once we get to Atlanta, but that's going to be a plate race too. So, hey, Ryan Preece could finish 4th at every race coming down to the line. Joey Logano probably should have won the race. It didn't happen. Kyle Busch, wow. That was surprising that Kyle Busch was willing to give up a win, essentially, to allow Denny Hamlin to get in front of him, and essentially took one for the team. You look at Logano, like I said, probably should have won it. And then Michael McDowell wasn't a Ford team player. He was the only guy on the Ford side of things that wasn't interested in getting a Ford to victory lane, apparently. Yeah, this was weird. This was a weird race. And the entire Speedweeks themselves really just were weird. I mean, the whole thing, I don't know. We'll see how the tapered spacer and higher downforce package works, especially once they get back to the plate tracks and get to Daytona in July. But by the same token, we could see this every week. And let me tell you, it's getting to the point with the constant crashing at the end of the races that it's annoying to watch it once a year just for the Daytona 500. So the potential of it happening every week is not the greatest. I don't know. I don't know what to think. I'm sure you've let me know a lot of thoughts down in the comments already. Thank you guys so much for watching. This has been David Land on YouTube, and we'll see you in the next video. Subscribe for more NASCAR and motorsport content.